What Rambam wants to call prophecy is what we call revelation, and it relates to those two great topic areas that he introduces, which he calls Maaseh Bereshit and Maaseh Merkavah. Maaseh Bereshit starts out with the account of creation in Genesis. The words Maaseh Bereshit in the Talmud refer to the account of creation that you have. Bereshit means in the beginning, the account of in the beginning. And the word Maaseh literally means the act of creation. How does God, who is infinite and transcendent and non-physical, create a world which is physical and determinate? That's one of the big problems in the guide. The other big problem is Maaseh Merkavah, the account of the chariot. The reference is to Ezekiel's story of his vision in the opening chapter of the book of Ezekiel in the Tanakh, where he seems to see this divine-like figure seated on a throne, which is traditionally called a chariot, partly, I guess, because it has wheels. Some of you may know that Negro spiritual, when I was a child, we called them Negro spirituals. A wheel within a wheel, way up in the middle of the air. That was the vision that Ezekiel had, and Maimonides has to explain that, and explain it in a way that will avoid the notion that Ezekiel, who is not the greatest of all prophets compared to Moses, seemed to see this divine figure. How do you see God? It tells you again and again that God can't be represented. Bereshit, Genesis, doesn't attempt to represent God. It doesn't tell you, as I mentioned before, doesn't tell you the backstory about God, as myths always try to do. What happened before the egg, what happened before the darkness. Doesn't have to tell you about the war among the gods that led to the triumph of one set of gods over another. Genesis dives right in and tells you right at the beginning, in the beginning God created heaven and earth. And you have to ask yourself, if you're a person who asks questions, how could it be that a transcendent God created the world? And similarly, you have to ask yourself, how can this infinite and transcendent being condescend, make himself small enough to be apprehensible by us? How can God communicate with us? And that's the question about revelation. Revelation is not a problem for people who don't think that there are any problems in Scripture, for people who are inclined to just gloss over such issues, but for people who think about such things and think about the discontinuity and the disproportion between an infinite God and a finite intelligence, between a transcendent God and us here and now who live in the sensory world. All our language is derived from the world of the senses. How are we to think about knowing God, and how is God going to be able to communicate with us? Got a couple of philosophers here. Philosophers know that the biggest problem in metaphysics, the one problem that philosophers today are still willing to admit that it is a problem, is the problem of the mind and the body. The mind is described in non-physical terms. I was happy, I was sad, I learned something, I forgot something. The body is described in physical terms. How much do you weigh? How tall are you? What's your heart condition? These sets of language don't go together. And this is what the people who engage in metaphysics today unapologetically call the great problem, the really big problem, the really hard problem in philosophy. And if you think about it in more general terms, the problems that the Rambam is dealing with in the guide, under the two famous headings, Maaseh Bereshit and Maaseh Merkavah, the account of creation and the account of Ezekiel's vision, which is just a special case of the general problem about divine revelation, those are broader and more general notions of what philosophers have singled out as the mind-body problem. They know that there's a difficulty. Some people like to dismiss that. That's one way of dealing with a problem, is not dealing with it, right, dismiss it. But if you see a problem there, you'll be scratching your head and you're wondering how to address that problem. The particular issue about revelation starts out with that business about we have a finite intelligence, our thinking is rooted in the world of sensory objects. Our language is entirely derived from that world. Our knowledge is derived from that world. Whatever we know from our experience of life in the world. How our bodies feel, what the body tells us about what's out there in the world. Very, very big, difficult problems. Think about Descartes, by the way, philosophers in the room. Descartes has to figure out how his mind, which is something that thinks, can be in touch with something that can't be touched, right? Physical objects, other people. Big problem for Descartes. Different philosophers tackled that problem in different ways. But if you think about it, that's generically much the same problem as the problem of God's relationship to the world. How does God make himself known to us? And there's a particular version of that problem which is of great interest in Jewish philosophy in general. Not only how does God reveal himself to us, to human beings, to prophets, but a special case of that problem is how does God scale down his infinite perfection to make moral and legal demands of us? Because the Torah, as you know, contains 613 commandments, which are addressed not to animals, not to plants, but to human beings. How does God scale down his infinite perfection so that he's not asking infinite perfection of us? God's going to tell us that we should be like God, and last time I was mentioning that when we are told to ascribe to be like God, we are told to be holy as God is holy, and that holiness involves transcendence, that we should try to overcome and transcend our own limitations. But the degree to which a human being who is finite, lifespan limited, body limited, desires and capabilities limited, how do we aspire to protect ourselves, and how does God scale himself down enough to make concrete demands of us? Why resting on the seventh day? Why not resting every other day? Why not resting all the time? How does God accommodate our human capabilities? That's a special case of the general problem about revelation. And Rambam describes that problem in terms of prophecy. He wants us to recognize that the people we regard as prophets have some kind of special access to God. And the question is, how is that possible? How does God make that possible? How has God made us capable of doing something that animals can't do, plants certainly can't do? They all get direction from God. The plants grow and the animals reproduce and multiply, and that's the little blessing that they're given. Not such a little blessing. But human beings are told to emulate God. Human beings are said to be made in the image of God, and that image, as we learned already, Rambam understands that word image to refer to the human intellect. The image of God is not a physical image, because God doesn't have a physical manifestation. The image of God is the human essence, the human form. And you'll notice here that Rambam is reliant on Aristotle's version of Plato's idea that there is a form which gives reality to all things. And what makes each of us as human beings what we are is that human essence, the form of humanity, which we don't share. There are many, many characteristics that we do share with other animals. And Rambam has no embarrassment about referring consistently to human beings as a species of animal. But we're the species that's distinguished from other species of animals by having the capability of intelligence. That intelligence is our likeness to God. It's called our likeness to God, using that metaphor of likeness. And it's through that we have a connection with God. How does that work? And how does it work in particular in the case of prophets. Rambam learned a great deal about how to deal with that question from the reading that he did of Arabic philosophy. Much of Arabic philosophy was not written by Arabs. It was written in this case by a man of Turkic ancestry. He was named Al-Farabi, which is a reference to the region that his ancestors came from in Asia Minor. The Turks in those days did not live in Anatolia. The Turks were not living in Turkey. They came out of the steppes of Central Asia, and they were brought in by the Arabs, who had made amazing conquests in the Middle East, destroyed the Iranian Empire, which had existed for centuries, took away many of the richest provinces of the Byzantines, who had their capital at Constantinople, later named Istanbul. But the Arabs got tired of fighting their own wars, and before long acquired Turkic soldiery, often organized in battalions and legions of slaves who had ranks and discipline among themselves. They did the fighting for the Arabs, and the Arabs sat back and enjoyed the harem and other wine that they weren't supposed to be drinking. And of course, in that situation, if you studied ancient history at all, you know that the people who do the fighting wind up doing the owning. So by about the year 950, the Abbasid Caliphate at Baghdad had become a caliphate only in title. It was a form. They kept the nominal caliph busy with those pleasures that he was addicted to, and the real rulers were the Turkic soldiery, and they had dynasties and effective. Those of you who've been in Jerusalem know some of that, because you'll see walls that were built in Jerusalem by the Mamluks. And Mamluk was an Arabic word for somebody who owned somebody who was a slave. They had the slave dynasty. They ruled in much of the Middle East, nominally in the name of the caliphs. Well, Al-Farabi's people, he lived in Baghdad, later in Damascus. Al-Farabi was a very multicultural kind of guy. He was very interested in what we would today call the philosophy of language. He was very interested in the philosophy of culture, and you can see why. He's a man of Turkic origin, living in an Arab empire, with a religion different from the religion of his ancestors only a few generations back. And he's trying to make sense of that culture and that language. He wrote about logic. He wrote about philosophy of language and culture. And he, of course, knew Arabic well, although it wasn't his native language. And Rambam became very attached to the writings of Al-Farabi. It was from the writings of Al-Farabi that he first introduced himself to the logic of Aristotle, in which Al-Farabi was very proudly a representative. And naturally, Al-Farabi was interested in how is prophecy possible? How is it possible for a finite human being to know the word and the intentions and the demands of a transcendent God? And he wrote about that in several places, which Rambam was very familiar with. And he addressed that problem in a way that Rambam made great use of. You have to start by realizing that Rambam believed that the structure of the universe was tripartite. We like to think there's the world and there's God, and God is infinite and the world is determinate. Rambam believed that God's infinity was mediated by an in-between realm. He finds that the Torah makes a similar assumption. How does the Torah verbalize that assumption? it does so by reference to the idea of angels. Angels are beings that go in between God and, metaphorically speaking, execute God's will. If God is the implied monarch, the angels are the literally messengers. That's what the word malach in Hebrew means. The angel word angelos in Greek, same thing. An angel is a messenger. Poetically speaking, those messengers mediate between the infinite God and the determinate world. But you have to ask yourself, how do we resolve that poetry? How does that metaphor of messengers, what does that actually refer to? Rambam believed that the world is governed indirectly by way of the movements of the heavenly bodies. The big light of the sun obviously has a big influence on the earth. The lesser light of the moon has a lesser influence on the earth. You can see it particularly in the tides, for example. And the planets themselves are supposed to have an influence on the earth. Many people took that idea, which came out of Greek philosophy, and turned it into a kind of pagan superstition. That's where astrology comes from. Astrology is still around. They talk about what sign you're born under and what planet and what position of the sun influenced your birth. Rambam was a vigorous opponent of astrology. He didn't like it because it was pagan, and he didn't like it because it was fatalistic. Because if you knew that you were born under a certain sign and your fate was determined by that sign, you wouldn't make the effort to be a better person. You wouldn't make the effort. You'd say, well, it was fated. And he explicitly wrote against that at great length. But he did believe in that tripartite universe. He tried to do what he saw as a scientific version of that partition. So one of the things you've got to learn, if you're a serious inquirer, Rambam says, you have to learn about the tripartite nature of the world. You have to learn what God is, you have to learn what the earth is by studying natural science, and you have to learn about that in-between realm, which is represented by the heavenly bodies. According to Aristotle, the heavenly bodies are all governed by incorporeal intelligences, non-physical minds. And those minds solve a problem that Plato and Aristotle left behind, which Neoplatonists were able to solve, partly with the help of the great Jewish philosopher Philo, who lived around the time of the year dot, a little BC, a little of the Common Era. The problem I like to call the housing problem. Where do you put Plato's forms? Plato believed that the world is an expression, a pale copy, a faint copy of the essences of things which exist up there in themselves. I shouldn't say up there because they don't exist physically, which exist in themselves and are the causes of all things. And there was a real serious problem about that, a number of problems. One problem was, how do you count the forms? They don't seem to have an arithmetic like bodies. We know how many bodies there are in this room. We can count them, and we know when we've counted one and not to count the same one twice. But you can't do that with forms. The form of dog and the form of cat. If you ask the question, Aristotle does ask the question, are the form of dog and the form of cat the same or different? Well, they're the same in that they both represent mammals. But they're different in that, as T.S. Eliot taught us on the musical stage, a dog's a dog, a cat's a cat. They're different, all right? So how do you account for the fact that the forms have a quirky, weird arithmetic? They can't be counted like bodies. Bodies can be counted by the individuation that they get from their embodiment. Forms cannot. There's another problem about the forms that Aristotle raised. And Aristotle liked to say, Aristotle was Plato's student for 19 years. And he learned a thing or two during those 19 years, or he wouldn't have stuck around. But he said, when he departed from Plato on the question of the forms, he said, I'm a friend of Plato, but I'm a closer friend of truth. And he abandoned the theory of forms because he couldn't explain the arithmetic of the forms. And for another reason, there were many reasons, but I'm mentioning two in particular. One is that the forms didn't have a clear-cut arithmetic, and the other is that Plato thought the forms were causes of all things in the world. Well, if these are the ultimate causes, notice the big difference between the forms and things in the world. Essences, as Plato understood those forms, do not change. Aristotle agreed with Plato about that. But things in the world are changing constantly. How is it that things in the world can be effects of a cause if the things in the world are constantly changing and the things that cause them are completely static, like the truths of mathematics or the truths of logic? Never change. Those are two of the reasons for which Aristotle rejected the theory of forms and left behind for later philosophers the question of the housing problem, as they call it. Where do you put the forms? Okay, where are the forms? And the causation problem. How can the forms which are unchanging give rise to, have as their effects, things in the world that do change, where the forms don't change? Philo contributes to the solution of that problem, and later Platonists, because Plato's school lasted almost 1,000 years after his time. It's called the Academy, and all academies are named in honor of it. Plato's school, the Academy at Athens, went on trying to understand what to do with the forms. And a great Alexandrian Greek culture, I think he was Egyptian by race, Plotinus, founded a new way of merging the philosophy, reconciling the philosophy of Aristotle and Plato. And the way he solved the problem was to locate the forms in the mind of God. That solved a big problem of Aristotelian philosophy, because Aristotle's God seemed to be thinking all the time, but only thinking the highest thoughts, which meant that he was only thinking of himself. That didn't look very divine. And the problem of causation. How can incorporeal, unchanging things cause effects which involve constant change? The idea was that physical things are somehow the scaled down precipitate, if you will, it's a metaphor from chemistry, my metaphor. Physical things are scaled down interpretations of those forms. These tables that we're using here are expressions of the pure idea of a table. The pure idea of a table can't really be sat at and set your breakfast on. We don't know how many legs there would be in a pure idea of a table. We don't know what kind of surface it would have, what kind of bigness it would have. The particulars that instantiate the forms interpret them in all kinds of different ways. So there's the table at the lunch counter, and there's the table in the other room, and the table in your dining room. They're all different interpretations of the idea of the table. And in that way, we can regard Plato's forms, now housed in the mind of God. So God won't be just thinking about himself, he'll be thinking about all things, and all things as expressed in those particulars, all right, through their forms. Maimonides, like Al-Farabi, bought into that way of understanding the structure of the universe, the structure of the reality of the universe. The highest reality is God, but God has, as part of his understanding, all those forms that give reality to things, including the forms that give reality to us as human beings, and all animals and all things. You can get a hint here, what we'll have to talk about, of how God could know finite things, which was a big problem for the Muslim philosophers. How could God know finite particulars which are physical when God is not physical. You could see the key to a solution there, because God would know those things by way of their forms, because God knows the universals as universals. But you can also see the inkling of the idea that Al-Farabi got by reading Plato of how God could communicate to us. Metaphorically, it would be said that God communicates to human minds through messages, through pronouncements, and the Torah uses that kind of imagery. The Torah talks about God speaking to people and God commanding people and God looking out for people. But if you take the idea of God speaking as poetry, then you have to understand what the poetry refers to. What is it that when the Torah says that God spoke to Moses and told him, tell the Israelites to do such and such, what does that metaphor of God speaking refer to? God doesn't have a tongue or lips. God doesn't have a vocal cord. God doesn't have a body at all. So you want to try, if you're Rambam or if you're a serious reader of the Torah, the kind who has been exposed to thinking about things as problems, you got to know what that metaphor refers to, how to resolve that metaphor into its reference. In the astronomy of the Rambam's day, which was Ptolemaic astronomy, the astronomy of the great Greek astronomer Ptolemy, translated into Arabic, and we still know it by its Arabic title, Almagest. That wasn't its original title, but any word in astronomy that starts with AL, you know that refers, Altair is the bird, right? If you know your Arabic. The notion was that the planets are not really gods, but they're ruled by and directed by and regulated by incorporeal intelligences, which are not just passive, but active, thoughtful, causal beings. Aristotle thought that the planets express their admiration for the highest God by a kind of vast choric dance, which astronomers can observe, which has never changed throughout time, and in its changelessness is the expression of divine influence. And I have to tell you now, since the word influence is a word that we still use, influence is an astrological term. The flowing forth of a non-physical idea, the flowing forth of a non-physical form of control, regulated by that idea. Those incorporeal intelligences were Aristotle's counterpart, his philosophical counterpart, to the pagan gods. He didn't think that the gods were running around seducing each other's wives. He thought that the gods were regulating life on Earth, and that they did so through the influences of the planets. So far, so good? Am I going too fast? Am I going right? Okay? Aristotle had spoken about a stage of intellectual development which we might call catching on, which is another metaphor if you think about it. Grasping an idea, comprehending an idea, those are metaphors. You can grasp a cup. It's not the same as grasping an idea. Catching on? What are you catching? When you catch on to something, it's not like catching COVID. What are you catching? The idea was that a human mind is raw material that can get a form that comes from above. And the way things get forms that come from above is by way of the lowest of those incorporeal intelligences, those incorporeal minds that regulate the spheres. The lowest of them the one that's in physical terms closest to the earth, even though they're incorporeal, the one that regulates the lowest level of astronomy, was called the active intellect. Sometimes you'll see it translated as the actual intellect, or other. Active intellect is a good way to express it. The active intellect does two things in medieval philosophy, as developed by Al-Farabi and other Muslim philosophers. The active intellect gives form to things in the world. It's because of the active intellect that dogs are dogs and cats are cats. They have that nature. And they specify it further according to the different breeds and qualities and characteristics of the individuals. And of course, the active intellect gives human beings that material substrate, that basis for understanding, which is called the passive intellect. The passive intellect, like anything passive, is receptive. It's like the clay that you would write upon if you're writing on clay, or the paper that you're writing upon if you're writing on paper. It's receptive. And Aristotle, facing a problem, because Aristotle was not a philosopher to ignore a problem, Aristotle faced the problem of what makes the passive intellect active. What makes the potential understanding actually understand. And Aristotle reasoned, and I think his reasoning is very profound on this, even though I don't agree that there are intelligences running the spheres, because we don't think the planets are embedded in spheres anymore. Aristotle realized that if you're going to activate the understanding, it can't do that by itself. That would be like bootstraps. The word bootstrap has become such a dead metaphor that people really think they can lift themselves by their bootstraps. Try it. It can't be done. If your boots have straps, you can pull on them as hard as you like, you won't get off the ground. And Aristotle believed that there was a difficulty about saying that the passive intellect somehow becomes active and that what is potentially understood becomes actually understood. And Aristotle's notion was that we need help to do that. It's the active intellect that does that. He mentions it in two places, and Aristotle tends to shy away from getting too deeply theological, so it's only in two places. In the book of De Anima, the book on the mind or the soul, Aristotle talks in part 3, chapter 5, about the active intellect, giving you that little boost that you need, enabling you to understand things that you wouldn't otherwise have understood. And he mentions it in one other place in the Eudemian Ethics, which even serious philosophy students don't necessarily read. He talks about how processes can't get started by themselves. They need something to get them started. And there again, he refers to the active intellect, and he calls it God. Interesting. Why is that interesting, and why is it important to Rambam? Think about, if you've exposure to philosophy at all, you may have heard the problem of induction. The problem of induction is that you have finite experience and you extrapolate to make infinite predictions, right? We don't say that the law of gravity holds only on this earth. We say it holds everywhere between all physical bodies. They all attract each other with a force directly proportionate to their masses and inversely proportionate to the square of the distance between them. It was because you can generalize that notion that Newtonian physics was able to explain the orbits of the moon and the planets on the same principles that operate here on Earth. That was a revolutionary idea for Newton. People hadn't known it was the same principles, that the law of gravity is a universal law of gravitation. How do we universalize something where our experience is finite and fallible? You've got to press beyond the data in order to be able to make laws of science. Philosophers today are embarrassed by the notion of laws of nature, and so they refer to those generalizations as law-like. Well, that's all very nice. But if you're really going to have a notion of the uniformity of nature, your generalizations are going to have to be universal. Not just sort of universal, not just law-like. They're going to be laws of nature. Well, Aristotle was onto that problem and saw that you're going to have to use the help of the active intellect to push you over from finite experience and enable you to get that little boost that you need to universalize your generalizations. We know that Rambam is very interested in generalizations. We know, for example, that when it says you've got to help your enemy load his ass, it's not just about his ass, it's not just about his enemy. You're supposed to help everybody about any trouble that they get into. He's very good at generalizing. And the way he knows that he's able to generalize is that he is given a boost from the active intellect. That's the way the mind works. And that's the way inspiration can take place. Aristotle believes, and Rambam follows Aristotle in this, that when you understand something, you're not stuck with the examples that you've used to understand it. You're able to universalize it, to generalize it. And that's with the help of the active intellect. Don't shy away too much from the idea of the active intellect, because otherwise you'll be left with the problem of induction, and you won't be able to solve it empirically. I had a colleague in Hawaii, Chinese philosopher, who thought, he wrote his doctoral dissertation on how to solve the problem of induction by the law of large numbers. Let me tell you and save you the trouble of reading his dissertation. It doesn't matter how many samples you have. It doesn't matter how much experience you have. Your experience is always going to be finite, and it's never going to be universal, and you're never going to be able to use empiricism to get you universal laws. You're either going to have to give up on universal laws, or you're going to have to get a little help, as Aristotle saw very early on. Aristotle was no dope. Well, that is the beginning of understanding how it could be that someone might be inspired to solve a mathematical problem, might be inspired to see a natural relationship among things in the world we live in, the world of sensory things. But it's the beginning of a solution to the problem about how is prophecy possible. Why? Because there's two different difficulties about prophecy. One is about getting the idea, in this case the idea of a universal God. That's what Abraham had, according to the Rambam. And you'll notice at the beginning of each of the three sections of the Guide to the Perplexed, Rambam quotes a line from Genesis, I believe it's chapter 21, verse 33, where Abraham invokes El Olam, which you'll often see translated as the eternal God. Rambam does not understand it that way. He proves that Olam is not used that way it's not used as temporal term at all in the Bible. Ad Olam is temporal term, forever. Yeah, that's no. El Olam means a universal God, which is to say the only God, the God of the universe, the infinite God. Abraham was inspired with that idea, and you could see how Abraham got that idea by getting a boost from the active intellect, dwelling inside him and prompting him to universalize what others had thought, the power of the sun and the power of the moon and the power of all these different natural forces, which they divinized. And Aristotle thought that those were all not the really divine thing. The really divine thing has to be universal and therefore can only be one. If the active intellect helps us to solve mathematical problems, philosophical problems, scientific problems, that's all very nice. But the active intellect does so by way of concepts. It communicates to us the forms by which the active intellect gave things their natures. So you can understand what a dog is and what a cat is by linking up the rationality implicit in all the dogs and cats, what makes them work, how they differ from one another and so forth. You can understand that because the active intellect gave them those forms, and you can link up the subjective apprehension of that organizational principle with its objectification out there. And that's what science does. Science links the idea in the mind with the idea as expressed in natural things. But that by itself is not going to be enough. Not if you're talking about prophecy. Because one of the things that prophets have to do, since not everybody is a prophet, prophets are going to have to be able to communicate with people. And they're going to have to be able to communicate with people whose life and language and thinking are embedded in the physical world. They don't think conceptually, they think in physical terms. Pick up any newspaper and you'll see that the newspaper does not just start in the lead paragraph by describing the issue about inflation or voter registration or any such conceptual notions. It'll start out by saying that Mary Jones is having trouble putting food on the table, right? It'll start very concretely because it knows that that's where people are living. People are living in that sensory world of the problems they know and experience personally, and they don't typically think conceptually. You notice, by the way, that the Torah very often substitutes very concrete physical expressions and descriptions for general ideas. That example about the enemy and the ass is a good example, right? You can make the generalization, but the Torah doesn't express it as a generalization. It expresses it in terms of a situation that one might encounter. How is the person who is divinely inspired going to be able to communicate that inspiration to people who don't think conceptually, who are not in the habit of doing it that way, who will find it very abstract and foreign to their understanding if it's presented that way? Plato faced that problem when he talked about the myth of the cave. He talked about people, I mentioned it last time, people growing up and living in the dark and seeing shadows projected on the walls of the cave of people passing by on the road outside, and they think that these shadows are the realities, and they actually give prizes for the people who are best at recognizing which shadows are which. Okay? Plato thought that that's like the world we live in. And he thought that if somebody had got out of the cave and into the daylight, he'd have trouble with it at first. It would be very foreign. It would be blinding to his eyes at first. He wasn't used to the light. And gradually he would come to see the relationship between the shadows in the cave and the actual donkeys and horses that are passing on the road. Suppose such a person went back to the cave and tried to enlighten his fellow troglodytes, cave dwellers. And he told them, these things that you think are real, they're not the real things. And the prizes that you're giving are silly because you're not talking about perception and understanding at all. You're just talking about a little game that you play among yourselves. They would find it hard to understand him at first, and harder still to accept him. And eventually, if he pressed his point, they would kill him. Why did Plato think that? Because that's what had happened to his own master Socrates. Socrates had been executed by the Athenians for trying to enlighten people, even though he did so in a very indirect sort of way, mainly by asking questions and showing them the inadequacy of the conjectures they came up with as answers. There's a certain bitterness when Plato wrote about how the people in the cave would kill the person who pressed his point. And Plato has a solution to that problem. Plato's solution is that the person who wants to explain what reality is like without getting himself killed or ignored or persecuted or prosecuted would have to use poetry. Now, I know it's conventional to say that Plato didn't like poetry. That's one of the many false conventions that runs around. Plato loved poetry, but he had a profound understanding of poetry, and he knew its power, and therefore its risks. But you'd have to use poetry. What kind of poetry? It would be poetry like the English poets, so-called metaphysical poets, used, representing very abstract ideas, very pure ideas, in very concrete terms, representing the whole universe in a drop of dew, and the way the sunlight affects the drop of dew. Andrew Marvell wrote the poem, The Drop of Dew, The Dewdrop. You can look it up. The way that drop of dew is affected by the sunlight, the way it represents the whole world from its own tiny but unique perspective. How does that solve the problem for Rambam? That poetry, he believed, is found in the Torah. There's a reason why the language of the Torah uses so much indirection, reserves itself, not just about the description of God, but about things in general. Prophets are like philosophers. Philosophers, as Rambam understands them, are people who have a profound conceptual understanding of things. They're not just people who play at it or pretend to it. They're people who really do understand it. They're in touch with the active intellect, and they're understanding things as they really are. But if you want to try and communicate that understanding to large numbers of people, you're going to have to rely on poetry, and that's what the Torah does. That's why it says, Dibrat Torah Lashon Bnei Adam. The Torah speaks in keeping with human language. And human language is where people think concreteness lies. They don't understand that the real concreteness is in God and the expressions of God. Rambam is very interested in that kind of connection. He says in one of the chapters of the guide that the existence of angels is very unproblematic from the standpoint of the Torah. It takes it for granted. You can read that line as though it was just telling you something obvious, because angels are mentioned in the Torah. Or you could read it as telling you something a little deeper. After all, why would the existence of angels be unproblematic from the standpoint of the Torah? That's because the nature of angels, the nature of angels would have to make sense in a way that the people who read right through that line wouldn't necessarily understand. There has to be something that mediates between divinity and a finite intelligence. A finite intelligence whose language is entirely derived from the sensory world, and whose thinking is therefore very hard to raise above the realities of the physical world. You have to use poetry which raises that understanding, and that's why, remember the image that Rambam used near the beginning of the guide, that's why he thinks that the Torah is like that golden ball which is encased in a tracery of silver. The tracery of silver, when you look at that ball casually or hastily, you'll think it's a silver ball. But it has islets in it. And the word islet, the Arabic equivalent, the Hebrew equivalent, is used in the text. He goes about proving to you that the islet is something that you can see through. That's why it's called an islet. If you study it, if you work on it, if you ask yourself the question, what is all this poetic language referring to? then you'll see that there's something gold inside. Something more profound than the practical rules that we have for living with one another, which is important enough, just as silver isn't precious in its own right, but something that relates us to God and helps us to make that relationship firmer and stronger, that was given by our having the intelligence we're given. A prophet, as the Rambam says, is a person who is not only a sound philosopher, not only has the insight, but can communicate the insight. This is an idea that he gets from Al-Farabi, and he develops it very beautifully. You're going to develop that understanding in terms of laws, in terms of rules, in terms of symbols, in terms of stories, in terms of rhetoric and oratory. Now, rhetoric is typically not the highest form of logic. Rhetorical arguments appeal to shared values, and yet they move people. You have to be able to move people to get them to think in the right kind of terms. The islets will lead you to conceptual knowledge, but even if you don't reach the conceptual knowledge, you'll have the symbolic surrogates for it. You'll know that God is one, even though you haven't quite figured out exactly what that means. You'll know that you should do the right thing, and you'll be willing to be guided by instances and examples of what doing the right thing looks like. And we'll leave it to the philosophers then to help you generalize it, that helping your enemy when his ass has spilled its load on the road doesn't refer just to enemies and doesn't refer just to asses. Right? In order to do that, a prophet has to have a special grace. He thinks that the general grace that intelligent people have to understand things through the use of their God-given mind, which is the image of God, that's universal. But he thinks that imagination, which is the vehicle that allows us to translate understanding into concrete imagery and symbols and laws and institutions and rituals, practices. The imagination is what enables us to transform conceptual understanding into doable, popularly knowable, practicable ways of thinking and ways of living. Bringing it down from the purely conceptual level and putting it on a level that's accessible to everybody. It's going to be mediated by their language. It's going to be mediated by the culture they've grown up in and the practice that they're used to. But it's going to be broadly acceptable in a culture which is historically bounded, which is physically limited. There's a proof in Al-Farabi and in Avicenna that the imagination is a physical capability. And the proof is a very neat one. The philosopher asks you to picture a triangle. You picture a triangle. And the picture that you have in your mind is of a three-cornered figure. It's not a concept. You can develop concepts about it, and you can prove that the triangle has to have its angles equal to 180 degrees, two right angles, as they used to say. But the triangle you picture in your mind is somehow mapped in your brain. And it was known by Al-Farabi and Avicenna, who followed him on this point and agreed to by the Rambam, that the imagination is a physical capability located in the brain. Why is that important? Because he doesn't think that being a philosopher is going to be enough to make you a prophet. In order to be a prophet, you have to be a philosopher, which means knowing the truth, not just pretending to know the truth. Knowing the truth that you get help understanding from the intelligence that's God-given and from the boost God gives you by the active intellect, and then being able to communicate it to others who don't have the same conceptual, intellectual gift. You can do that by rhetoric, you can do it by oratory, you can do it by symbolism, and you'll see in the prophets, we read in a prophet, the angel would say, "What do you see?" He'll say, I see a candelabrum. What does it mean? I see two staffs. What does it mean? Sometimes the prophet doesn't know what it means, and the angel or God has to tell him, has to unwrap the symbolism for him. Prophecy, the rabbis say in the Talmud, is the 60th part. Dreaming, the prophets say, the rabbis say, dreaming is the 60th part of prophecy. Dreaming and prophecy are on a par with each other, except in the case of Moses. Any prophet besides Moses is using the imagination to mediate between the conceptual apprehension that he has and the intellectual apprehension that people are going to need if they're going to be able to believe or commit or act on these ideas. In Moses' case, we have a special exception, and it's the exception we read about when we read how Miriam and Aaron were criticizing Moses, and God has to tell them. Others might have dreams and visions, but Moses, and only Moses, has talked to God face to face. Now you have to resolve that metaphor. God doesn't have a face, but it means that God and Moses communicate directly. How? Rambam understands that to mean mind to mind. Moses has the right kind of mind, and his prophecy is not mediated by the imagination. Everybody else who is a prophet, the prophecy has to be mediated by imagination. That's how the person is enabled to communicate those ideas to ordinary people who are not conceptual thinkers and don't have to be assumed to be conceptual thinkers. Imagination can mislead. There are all kinds of frauds and mountebanks around who have the imagination but don't have the idea. There are also people who have dreams that seem to connect with something and they don't really know what it connects with. There's a Misa about a fellow who took a lot of animals into his house and didn't appreciate how much space he really had until he gradually got them all out of his house. That Misa actually traces back to the Rambam himself, who said somebody might think he's a prophet because he thinks he was inspired with a new idea that he didn't know before, and really it's just that his mind was cluttered, and when he got all the nonsense out of his head, he noticed something that he hadn't noticed before because he wasn't paying attention. That's like, the Rambam says, that's like a person who had a lot of animals in his house and didn't notice one little animal that was there. That wasn't a new idea. That wasn't an inspiration. An inspiration starts out with a pure conceptual understanding, but then becomes communicable. And here I have to tell you of a nexus, a connection that Rambam makes with a philosopher who is too often contrasted with him, namely with Halevi, the great poet of an earlier generation, earlier century, great Hebrew poet who wrote in Arabic, the Kuzari. And Halevi is often contrasted with the Rambam because Halevi, being a poet, thought that language was very important. Halevi, being a Zionist, back in the day, longed to leave the land of the West, and he wrote famously in one of his poems, Libi b'mizrach v'anochi b'sof ma'arav, my heart is in the east, but I am in the furthest extreme of the West, which in those days was Andalusia, Spain. Geography was very important to Halevi. Language was very important to Halevi. And what do geography and language have in common? Embodiment. Embodiment was very important to Halevi. And Halevi believed that language and geography were essential characteristics of the people of Israel. That's why he wanted the people of Israel to live in the land of Israel. That's why he wanted them to use good Hebrew poetry, and why he wrote such great Hebrew poetry. And this is a point of contact between Halevi and Rambam, where they're usually contrasted, because Rambam is supposed to be the intellectual, the metaphysical, the scientific, and Halevi is the poet, the embedded believer in the Jewish body and the presence of God, the inspiration of God through language. Rambam believes that what differentiates a philosopher in general from a philosophical poet who has truths to communicate and the ability to communicate them to others, that rests on the imagination, which is embedded in the body. That is where Rambam and Halevi agree. He thinks that God has given not everybody who does the right study, not everybody who has the right kind of intellect is going to become a prophet. He mentions examples of people who are mentioned in the Tanakh who tried and were trained and did all these things but never became prophets. Why not? They didn't have the gift. What gift? The right kind of brain matter that would enable them to do the oratory, the rhetoric, the symbolism, all the things that a poet does to translate pure, true ideas into beliefs, practices, visual images, auditory images, which is where poetry gives rise to prophecy. Okay? I think that's a good place to stop. I'm really delighted to hear questions. If there's anything that was unclear or anything that you'd like to pursue, let's stop there and let everybody get their thoughts out on the table. Yes, please.
I have two questions. We'll see if we have time for both. But the first one is regarding how the Rambam thinks about angels.
Yes.
We spoke a little bit about that today, and I know in the Mishnah Torah he lists out a hierarchy of the species of angels, with Chayot being the top and further down.
Yes.
And then in the most perplexing chapter of the guide that I've read so far, chapter 7, he speaks about how Adam gave birth to demons. Check it out. It's in there. Which is really fascinating. So what is the Rambam's thinking about angels and demons? Is it metaphor? Yeah. But he says he begot them. Yeah. So the question I have is how does the Rambam think about it? Is he using here a metaphor that I'm supposed to unravel, or does he believe this is a scientific nature about the world that we just can't interact with?
Okay. The question really has two parts, because what to say about those demonic beings that he says that Adam begat in between the birth of Cain and Abel and the birth of Seth. He says Seth was the first one who was really human, and those others were not really human. And he does refer to the Talmudic idea that they were demonic in character. I think it says they were shadim or something like that. He's glossing a hint that he takes from the verse in Bereshit which says that Seth was in the image of Adam. And you might ask the very midrashic question, why the image of Adam? Why not the image of God like Adam? It's important that he was in the image of Adam because Seth was human. And the Rambam is as good with midrash as Plato is with mythology. The reference, he thinks, is to the fact that those legendary beings and he's not really saying that there were legendary beings, but he's piggybacking on that idea. Those legendary beings that Adam begot before the birth of Seth did not have the image of Adam. That is, they weren't really human. Why not? Because they weren't educated by Adam, and Seth was. And that gives you the importance of education, because education humanizes you. You're not really fully human unless you've incorporated, unless you've had help incorporating that way of living and that way of thinking that Seth has, and that those imaginary beings didn't have. It's a similar point. I've written something about this recently. There's a similar point that's made by Aristotle reading Homer. When Aristotle reads Homer, he finds that Ulysses goes to the island of the Cyclops, and the Cyclops have only one eye, and they are cannibals, and they are not human. And part of the fact that they are not human is represented by the fact that they have no culture, they have no society, they have no rules, they have no laws. And I think the fact that they have no eye, only one eye, represents the fact that they have no bipolar vision, which gives you a little perspective, if you will, moral perspective, I think. But and they don't have gods, and they don't have culture, and Zeus has given them a kind of double-pronged gift, because they don't need agriculture, so they don't need each other. They just live on their flocks and just eat things raw and so forth, and eat people. They're inhuman. Aristotle takes a hint from Homer about the need for culture and education to humanize us. It does that by way of language, according to Aristotle. And Rambam is following that idea and finding a midrashic basis for it in the Torah, because he thinks that I don't believe he really thought that there were shadim or whatever they're supposed to be, demons. But the point is that Seth, being educated by Adam, has that culture, which enables him to grow up as a human being. And the descendants of Cain and Abel, of course, don't really make it. Abel has no descendants, and Cain's descendants are all wiped out by the flood. So the descendants of Seth are humanity as humanity. Now, coming back to the big part of the question about what he thinks about angels, I think that he wants to make the idea of angels at home to philosophers by representing angels as the poetic expression of the idea of the intermediary between God and nature. And that intermediary in terms of creation, in terms of governance, and above all in today's lecture in terms of inspiration. We need something from God. I would say, if we're going to do away with the idea of angels, because we don't believe that the stars and planets exist in spheres which are transparent, and we don't hold that system of astronomy any longer. I think we have to say, and I hinted this in our first lecture, God does it himself. B'atzmo v'chodo. As it says in the Haggadah of Pesach, it wasn't by way of a seraph, it wasn't right. That God got us to Egypt by himself. God doesn't have separate faculties. God is, and God does, directly rather than indirectly. And I think that's a better way for us today to interpret what he says. But I'll point out one thing to you where he claims, he gives, if you will, an indirect footnote to the idea that he's deriving from Plato as the angels as poetic expressions of the idea of divine intelligence and divine expression in the world. And the hint that he gives you, it is just like a footnote, is when he says, that when God went about his way to create, and he wanted to create the human being, the first thing it says is Na'aseh ha'adam, It uses the plural. Let us make man in our own image. And the Midrash, of course, has lots of different explanations of why God uses the plural. But the explanation that Rambam kind of likes is that God has helpers. God doesn't do anything without his pamalia. Pamalia, you can tell from the fact that it has more than 3 root letters, is a foreign word in Hebrew. It's cognate with the Latin word familia. It comes from a Greek word meaning the same thing. And familia means God's familiars in the old royal sense of his retinue. God consulted his retinue. And he picks up a passage from the Midrash where it says that God consulted his retinue. And Rambam loves that because it says, look, it says he consulted. Now the Midrash is actually interested in the fact that you shouldn't do anything very important without consultation. You have to have a committee meeting. You can't just do it by yourself. And God is setting an example. But Rambam likes the fact that the Midrash uses the same word consulted that Plato used. When Plato wants to ascribe the creation of the world in the Timaeus, great dialogue that Plato wrote when he was about 80, it says the same thing. That God delegated this task to the demiurge, which is the craftsman. So if anything goes wrong, you blame the craftsman, right? But the demiurge consulted. What did he consult? He consulted the pure forms of things because he wanted them to be as good as possible. The forms are perfect. The world being made out of matter is not going to be perfect, but it's going to be as good as possible. And you do that, if you're in the contracting business, you know, you have to have a plan. And you consult about the plan, and you consult the plan, and you look to the plan to see how to do it correctly. So he likes the idea that God consulted his pamalia, right? Because that shows that the forms that are the pattern for the world, the pattern for all the goodness of the world, the pattern for things working and all the organisms, having organs that serve the interests of the organism and so forth, all that. He likes the fact that Plato used the same word consulting. Plato writing in Greek, Rambam writing in Arabic, but he likes that idea. I don't know. Was there a second question?
There is a second question, but I want to
Let's hear from others, and we'll come back to your second question. Yes, Blake.
I had a question about knowledge, prophecy. So, as I understand what you're saying is that the idea emanates from God.
Yes.
It goes through the active intellect.
Yes.
And then the prophet receives it, and he figures out how to disperse that information through
That's right.
through
With the help
poetry.
of imagination.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. Right.
So there's when that happens, I guess there's 2 issues I see with that. One is that how does the average person differentiate between, an idea that actually came from God versus an idea that some person came up with? That's
right.
That's kind of the first thing, because it leads you to a situation where you have to try to explain something after the fact. You have a lot of trouble. How do I reconcile these 2 things?
Good
The other way.
By the way, that's a question that he addresses in the guide.
Yeah, the other way of gaining knowledge that's more modern is through observation, the scientific method.
But I mentioned a problem about that. You're going to always be left with the problem of reduction when you try and do it by observation.
Right. The problem.
I know all the people in this room have 2 legs. I can go through and I can count. If I try and generalize on that and say that all human beings have 2 legs, not going to work. Some of them have been in a war zone and lost a leg. And your ability to generalize has to be based on the right idea, which is the idea in the Rambam's case and in Aristotle's, the idea that gives rise to the form of the thing as a member of its species, not just by surveying and observing. It's the old black swan problem. All the swans we've seen in England seem to be white. Roberta and I went to England and we saw some swans that had been brought in from another country, and lo and behold, they were black. Experience is limited. Go ahead.
Right. So, as you know, the answer to that, of course, with Spinoza would be that each thing's an individual and they're not really collections, right? So collections are a convenience for us, so that we can communicate and live and
That
stuff
means
like
there's-
that.
that means you can't get that. I don't agree with you about Spinoza. You know that, but
Okay.
but if that were true, that means that you couldn't get scientific laws. You couldn't extrapolate.
practical. There's a lot.
It's very practical. We'll have to do that one. You and I'll arm wrestle about that one another time. I don't think that Spinoza really did away with species of things anyway, but and Spinoza does generalize. For example, he says nothing is more useful to man than man.
Right.
That's a generalization. And anyway, I want to go back to the first question because I think Rambam has a nice answer to that one. The first question was, how do you tell the difference between a prophet and a pretender?
Yeah.
There were pretenders in his own time too. Shabtai Tzvi was in the 17th century when the world was in a terrible mess. But the Jewish world was in a pretty terrible mess in the Rambam's time too, and there were false messiahs and false prophets in his own time. He had a right to the people of Yemen. They still revere the Jews from Yemen. They don't live in Yemen anymore. About 6 of them do. But the Jews from Yemen had to deal with, and they wrote to Rambam for advice. And he gave them advice about false messiahs. And there were even false messiahs in Spain in the time of false prophets in the time of when he was a child in Spain. Here's what he says, and I think it's very interesting, and it gives you a hint into the rationalism and the naturalism behind the Rambam thinking. He says the way you interpret whether an inspiration, not just an inspiration, but an idea of law came from God. When a system of law comes from a human being, it's concerned with the material welfare. If it's corrupt, it'll be the material welfare of the ruler, like Un in North Korea. But if it's an honest human legislator, it'll deal with the welfare of the human beings that are going to be under its purview. That means avoiding force and fraud, protecting the people's security and material welfare, regulating the economy. Those are the concerns of a human-made law. A divine law is concerned with 2 other things. It starts with that one. That's the most basic. You can't manage if you're starving, and he says that. But a divine law is concerned with improving human moral character, as for example, helping your enemy upright his ass, and it's concerned with conveying the right ideas. It does the first of those 2 things by regulating behavior to get people in the right kind of actions and responding, or creating a culture where people are responsive to one another's concerns. Notice in Nashville, until very recently, if you're stopped at a red light and you stop for a minute before the light changes green, the guy behind you doesn't lean on his horn. That is a characteristic of courtesy which people emulate and people are used to. People don't steal parking spaces from each other. I saw this in Hawaii. I did not see it in New York. I did not see it in Southern California.
Or in Israel.
The culture, the culture promulgates these things. You can allow a red turn on a red light in LA when I was a kid, because people don't go plowing through the pedestrian intersection. You cannot allow it in New York because people zoom right ahead and you'd have casualties from that. So the culture is very important, and he believes, unlike the liberal dispensation, he believes that a divinely given law seeks to improve people's character. That means to give them the dispositions of character that make them considerate and concerned with one another. That's the second thing. The third thing is it tries to convey good ideas. And I mentioned before, and I'll stress it again, conveying ideas is something which liberal societies reject. They think that that is not a proper function of government. Rambam thinks it is the highest function of government, and he thinks that it can only be done by way of that kind of poetry. Which means that unlike Christianity and Islam, in Judaism it's done by way of ideas, it's not done by way of dogma. Remember? Does you believe? Does you believe? Okay? That was the thing they used to kid about when I was in elementary school. They dunked the person's head in the water. Okay, what does you believe? I believe you're trying to drown me. Okay? Forcing people to hold certain beliefs is not the way to inculcate beliefs. According to the Rambam, the Torah does it the right way. It does it by way of poetry. It does it by way of agadah. It does it by way of stories which inspire people with the right ideas. It does not do it dogmatically. That's very, very important to the Rambam. Now, he says you may find another system of law which does the same three things. And he's thinking about Christianity and Islam. What does he say about those? They're copies. They're not the original. He thinks that Christianity and Islam are based on Judaism, which is historically true, and they've got the same basic idea about God and about behavior. They don't always live up to it, but they're supposed to. We don't always live up to it either, but we're supposed to. But that's how you tell the difference. All right? He's very non-exclusivist about those ideas. He thinks that they can be derivative, and that's okay. He doesn't think that Muhammad was a prophet. And he says that there's a test for that. A prophet is somebody, I've defined for you already today what a prophet is according to the Rambam, but a prophet is somebody who is so connected with God that he's really not concerned with the sensory world. And he doesn't say so explicitly, but he does say so implicitly that Muhammad is a little too sensuous to be an authentic prophet. He picks up ideas which are Jewish and Christian ideas, and that's a historical fact. He's influenced by the Psalms, he's influenced by Ephraim of Syria, who was a Christian monk. And he gets his ideas of monotheism. He gets his idea of what a prophet is from Jewish scripture and Christian tradition. But he thinks he's an imitator, and he's not an authentic prophet because he's too sensuous to be a Christian prophet, to be a prophet of God. But he thinks that the religion is authentic enough, and he thinks that Christianity and Islam have had a big influence in spreading the monotheistic idea very widely, which he thinks is beneficial. Let's have another question for somebody else. Who? Ismail, please.
Thank you, Professor. It's always such a pleasure to listen to you. You explained that Rambam sees prophecy as a kind of strategy to get across those eternal truths in a metaphorical way.
Yes.
And conceptual way of understanding is distinguished from that metaphorical way of understanding.
Yes.
So perhaps that was the reason why Al-Farabi and other medieval philosophers were also kind of anthropological scholars in the sense that they learned and understood how their societies and cultures work. They were scholars of culture.
Yes.
And my question is, even though we can express those eternal truths in a conceptual manner, does something human still remain there? Or, so negative theologians, for example, argued that whatever we say about God, it'll be always human, therefore they prefer to just keep silence, because whatever you say about God will not be about God, it will be about your conception of the God. So if we, to the extent that we are able to articulate those eternal truths in a conceptual manner, as distinguished from metaphorical manner, do they get once and for all conceptual and very truthful, or is there still something human there?
Beautiful question. I'll pick up first on your remark about Al-Farabi's anthropological interests, which go very deep and go into philosophy of language, as you know. There's a comparable move in Maimonides. Towards the end of the guide, he writes about pagan culture. He doesn't have a lot of access to first-hand information about that culture, but there was a work that circulated in his time by, it's called the Nabatean Agriculture, it was by a guy named Ibn Waqshiyah, who thought that he was translating an ancient pagan work. Nowadays we know it wasn't an authentic ancient pagan work, but it does have a lot of ancient pagan traditions in it. And the Rambam does a very interesting thing in it, because very traditional Jewish scholars say that you shouldn't be reading pagan theory. That's a no-no. You don't read sacred books. He did read it. He read it very closely, and as you read on in the guide, you'll see him quoting at length from it. He wanted to study that work anthropologically to find out the circumstances under which the biblical laws were developed, because he thinks that the biblical laws, especially the laws that are often dismissed as ritual laws or ceremonial laws, are devised as a response to pagan practices. So whether you use yeast or not, all these things about whether the offering should have salt or not, that kind of thing. He thinks that the rituals of the Hebrew ceremonial law, as developed in the Torah, are responsive to pagan ritual in the same way that the stories in Bereshit and stories in Genesis are responsive to Babylonian mythology. Which is not something he knows about, but he'd be interested in that. He's interested in everything. So he doesn't want to close that door. The real heart of Ismail's question is, once you've done the negative theology thing and you think God is so transcendent that all you can say is what God is not, are you going to stay content there? Because once you try and characterize God, then you're back into the business of putting human features and human clothing onto God and slipped back. A very good question, and I think I see the answer to that question in two ways. One is in terms of the progression that the lexicon leads you to think of God in higher and higher terms. And he orients you towards that higher and higher, as I said in the last lecture, by way of what's more intellectual and less physical. More conceptual, less sensuous. That puts you on the right path, that points you in the right direction. Beyond that, you can think of the idea of absolute perfection. The problem Ismail raises is how are we supposed to think of perfection except in concrete physical terms? It's a big problem, and then you're slipping back. He has an idea, and the idea comes from an epiphany of Moses that happens after the golden calf. The Israelites have decided that it was really the golden calf that liberated them from Egypt. It was a horrible, disgusting thing they're saying, right? It's not just that they're singing and dancing, a la Cecil B. DeMille's projection of it, but they're saying this is the God that got us out of Egypt, this golden calf. Moses says, as the Rambam reads him, that we have to understand what God said when Moses wanted to see God's ways. He wants to see God's ways because he knows that he's going to have to govern these people, and all of us know Jews are difficult people to govern. And he's going to want to know how God governs nature. So when he asks God to show him his ways, God has already said he can't show him his face because you can't see my face. You're not a finite being. You can't see what God really is. But I can show you my back. Rambam interprets my back to mean God's ways. And that's responsive to what Moses really wanted to know, how God rules in nature. The vision that he's granted then, in terms of seeing God's back, is to see what flows from God, or what follows from God, or how God expresses himself in the world. So Rambam believes that when God showed Moses his back, it wasn't the knot of his phylacteries that he showed him, it was the panoply of nature. Why? Because Maimonides believes that when you study nature, you will learn two things. You will learn God's grace, and you will learn God's wisdom. You'll learn grace and wisdom from the intricacy of the design of nature. If you're a scientist, and nowadays they think the more science you do, the less religion you have. He did not think that. He thinks that if you study nature, you will see how all the parts of an organism contribute to the life of the organism and the continuation of the species. You'll see in the cycles of nature, you'll see how nature is preserved, and the stability of nature is maintained by the recycling of the elements. They're Aristotelian elements, but the cyclicity is still there. You'll be seeing God's grace and God's wisdom. Now, grace and wisdom are really human characteristics. And the way he puts it, this is where he does allow what Thomas will call an argument from analogy, that if we were makers of a system, these are the characteristics that we would ascribe the inventor. We would say that this inventor was very intelligent and very thoughtful and had it worked out so that the system would work well. That is the kind of analogy we can make with regard to God. So if you want to know more about God, beyond what you can learn from the ethical practices that God commands, you can learn it by the study of nature. You can learn it by studying science in an open-minded way, by learning about the wisdom of the system of nature, the wisdom incorporated in the body of all living things, and etc. That's how God actually did show Moses his ways. And that all gets articulated, and it's a phrase we use repeatedly in liturgy, and on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, we use this phrase again and again and again, appealing to God's grace and compassion. Because that revelation of God's grace, which is made to Moses when God shows him his back, is actually pronounced in words. It is say, Erech Apayim B'Rav Chesed V'Emet, etc. All right, that God is long-suffering and full of grace, right? And big emphasis on mercy and compassion and so forth, and a little bit about justice at the end, because that's the hard part. But those are the characteristics by which God rules in nature. They're human characteristics, all right, but he thinks that they're acceptable with regard to God. I'll say one more thing, because I know Ismail knows Islamic philosophy very, very well. There was a question about God's justice. And the Asherites, who became very prominent in the Islamic theology, believed that we have to say that God is just, but that doesn't mean that God has to do what we think is just. It's not up to us to judge God. And Rambam says at one point, these Asherites believe that if God punishes you for obeying him, or or rewards you for disobeying him, that's yours not the reason why. You can't ask. Okay? There's a phrase for that in Arabic, Bala kaif, don't ask how. And that's a kind of slogan of Asherite dogmatic theology. Rambam rejects that. He says that God is inseparable from his justice, which is to say, God is God's justice. Remember, God is not differentiated into attributes. But the justice symbolized by God's throne, which is a symbol of stability and therefore legitimacy of a monarch and therefore justice, God's throne is inseparable from God. That's why it says that God's throne is forever. Looks like you had a question. No? Okay.
Lenn, last
Please.
week you talked about
Moise.
justice. You said it was a balance.
That is true. He
Right?
says that.
So that justice is balance.
Yes.
So then does that mean there's a balance between good and evil? That if there's good,
No.
there's got to be evil?
No, it's a balance between kindness and severity. Because the people who do wrong have to be punished, but they're given another chance. They're given latitude. They're given an opportunity. And think about the laws of evidence with regard to serious crimes in Judaism. What are the laws of evidence? If you've got a capital offense, you need 2 witnesses to the overt act. Does that mean that some guilty people will get away with it? Yes, it does. It's inevitable. The stricter the penalty, the stricter the rules of evidence. That's a general fact about law in general, and we'll talk more about law in the 4th and final lecture. But the basic balance is between erech apayim b'rav chesed, very patient, giving people another chance, giving people the chance to repent, which is an idea very foreign to ancient Near Eastern civilizations, as Jeremiah Unterman has pointed out in his book. Between severity and patience. And God is to be understood. God's justice is a balance between the two. He uses that idea of balance also in respect to the idea of asceticism. We don't go overboard, we don't wear hair shirts, we don't torment the body, we don't think that God hates the body, right? But a good example of setting the kind of balance that he's thinking of is the laws of the Nazir. A Nazir is a person who has taken a vow of abstinence, that he's not going to drink wine, he's not going to cut his hair, and so forth. When the period of his vow has ended, the Nazir is supposed to make a sin offering. And the rabbis, of course, ask the question, a sin offering, what was the sin? Against whom did he sin? What's the answer? The rabbis say, he sinned against himself. He sinned against his own soul by denying himself these pleasures. A good haircut, a glass of wine now and then, okay? He offers a sin offering. That's an example of the kind of careful balance that Rambam sees. But it's not a balance between good and evil. It's a balance between, a balance in Aristotelian terms is always an optimum. It's an optimum achieved by balancing severity versus kindness.
So God is not justice. Justice is one of the attributes of God.
But he doesn't think that the attributes are anything separate from God. He says that God's justice is inseparable from God. That's unlike the Asherites who say that God's justice is not answerable to human. There's no injustice to a chattel. That's their phrase. We're God's chattels, and there's no injustice to a chattel. Yours not to ask the reason why. Balakaif. And balakaif is such a common phrase in Arabic referring to not asking the reason why that it actually gets turned into a verb. Balkafa, to deny the legitimacy of that question. We can pursue that further if you like, but I want to see if others have questions, comments.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. Oh, wait, Matt has one last question.
Well, are we on to 11? I don't want to be the last question. Well, I was just thinking about what you said about the astrology.
Yes.
And Rambam taking issue
Talk a
with
little
that.
louder, Matt.
So can you talk a little bit more about what he found objectionable to the astrology? Because isn't that more just explanatory and not about ethics, or was there an ethical?
It's not just explanatory. First of all, some of the explanatory part is based on false science. He's okay with the idea that the seasons are regulated by the planets. Not so okay with the idea that your nativity determines your fate. That's the kind of thing that people use as an excuse. Well, of course I seduced her. I had to. It was written in the stars. That's a very common belief. You'll find it in plays and poetry. No. The Greek writers said, ethos anthropoi daimon. It's Heraclitus, if I remember rightly. The demonic, semi-divine source of your fate is your character. Ethos. Ethos, the man's character is his fate. That's where the Rambam is. Now, character, as Aristotle pointed out, is in your own hands. You are responsible to form your own character. Your parents and your peers might help or hinder, but ultimately it's your job. So part of the objection to astrology is that it allows people to pass off their wrongdoing and their moral failings onto fate and the stars, or the DNA, or the genes. I'm just that kind of a person. No, you can't get away with that. The other part is that it is a remnant of pagan worship, which is forbidden. So if you see a fountain in the mall and you throw a penny into it, that's because people used to put a coin into a well. Why do people put coins in wells? Why?
Probably to awaken some spirit at the bottom of the well.
To feed the spirit, to pay off the spirit. Of course. That was a form of pagan worship. Now, most people don't know that. When you go see the movie Three Coins in the Fountain, movie from the 50s, Fountain of Trevi, it was a custom to throw coins in the fountain. It was supposed to bring you good luck. Why was it supposed to bring you good luck? That's a secularized version of the pagan offering to the spirit that dwelt at the bottom of the well. We don't believe that there are spirits dwelling at the bottom of the well. Now, Rambam knows that not everybody who follows a pagan custom is really a pagan. But that kind of custom perpetuates that kind of attitude. Once you start saying, it'll bring you luck when you wish upon a star, okay? The stars are not divine. In his view, they're physical expressions of manifestations of the divine. Right? In our view, that's the view that Socrates was blamed for holding, that the sun was just a big mass of matter. It probably is. Right? No. It's fatalism and paganism that he finds in astrology, that he finds objectionable in it. Please, Linda.
This isn't a question, but I have to, in view of what you're saying, Mike and I were recently at a conference, and the speaker was talking about, people are blaming their lives on astrology, and, how often do you hear Mercury's in retrograde? So he puts this slide up, he says, now let's think about how far Mercury is from here. And then there's this big, you have to think of the distance, and then there's this big picture of Mercury. And then there's this little pin dot. He says, that's the retrograde. He says, do you think your life is really, really controlled by that? And I've been laughing about it because it's like so crazy to see this gigantic picture of Mercury, however far away it is, with this little pinprick that shows Mercury in retrograde that seems to be, people think, are affecting their lives.
Well, there are all kinds of ways, and one of the earliest ways of refuting astrology was to coordinate, if everybody's born on a certain day is supposed to have the certain fate, right? Test that out by the empirical means. It doesn't work out very accurately. And Rambam is very impatient about astrology, and I have to explain to you that since it did have philosophical roots, and it did have scientific expressions, it was very popular in his time among philosophers who thought it was scientific. So he was being bold in rejecting it. And his reasoning, I stress, his reasoning was that it gave people a way of getting off the hook for their moral responsibility, for their own character, and it gave people a way of being passive about their lives and being fatalistic. Okay, I think. Moise, go ahead.
Another quick
Okay,
little example.
okay.
Modern Orthodox Sephardic rabbis
Yes.
are publishing and writing a lot of stuff about how there is no magic. The mezuzah is not magic.
They're right.
You kiss the mezuzah because it reminds you of God's power.
Yes.
But in Sephardic tradition, there's been a lot of,
Rambam
you know, the
hated
pui
idea
pui or
of
the.
using a mezuzah as a talisman. That's a desecration of God's name. Rambam hated that idea. It's the interesting thing. I'll give you one last thing, and then I gotta have my bagel. There are mentions of talismans in the Talmud, and some of them are tolerated, and some of them he can explain that maybe there was an empirical basis for it, but the reason for the empirical basis he draws upon the writings of one of the great Muslim physicians. He says if they really believed it would be helpful to them, maybe it would be, and we tolerate it.
Placebo effect.
That was a placebo effect. Early mention in the Rambam, and we have a friend up in Boston who has done important scientific research on the placebo effect, and he made the front page of the paper a few years ago by proving the placebo effect works even if the people know that they were given a placebo. It's paradoxical, but there you have it. But when it gets into the realm of using a symbolism that's too directly associated with pagan practices, he comes down pretty hard against it. Okay. Oh,
One
right.
question.
Okay.
What
Nobody
about
wants
the
to get away.
idea of doing things to avoid the evil eye and talking about
That's superstition.
Okay.
And superstition is a secularized, popularized, vulgarized version of pagan worship. Okay. Thank you all very much. I'm so glad you're here.